So let's go ahead and move on to God's sovereignty and human volition at the cross. And I want to look at this briefly to talk about what happened at the cross and to see both God's sovereignty and man's will coming together at the cross. Now, one can see God's sovereignty and human volition working simultaneously at the crucifixion of Jesus. In the sovereignty and wisdom of God, without overruling human volition, the Lord accomplished his will by means of the wills of wicked men who sought to oppose him. Luke, who wrote the book of Acts, he wrote the Gospel of Luke and he wrote the book of Acts, basically a 2-volume set. He says in Acts 2:23, he pulls together these two truths in this one verse. And he says in Acts 2:23, he says, this man, and of course here he's talking about the Lord Jesus Christ, this man delivered over by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. He says, you, talking to the leadership of Israel here, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men, that would be the Romans, you nailed to a cross by the hands of godless men and put him to death. So what we see here is both coming together, both sets of wills, the will of God and the will of man. Now here, wicked men did their worst against God and his Messiah. They rejected him. They subjected Jesus to a series of illegal trials, 6 of them, 3 religious and 3 civil, and this all took place illegally under the cover of darkness from roughly midnight to 6 a.m. And there were false witnesses that were brought in, and during the time Jesus of his trials, he was mocked, he was beaten, he had a crown of thorns placed upon his head, Pilate had him scourged, and then he was sent off to be crucified. And this is just, it's the greatest miscarriage of justice in the history of the human race. And here we have these people that are setting their will against the will of God and against the Messiah. So here these wicked men did their worst against God and his Messiah, and yet, here's what's fascinating, what was done to the Messiah, Luke tells us, was done by the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. By the predetermined plan and foreknowledge of God. Now, Luke records something similar in Acts 4:27 and 28, when he records Peter's prayer to God, and in that prayer, Peter says the following. He says, for truly in this city there were gathered together against your holy servant. Here he's talking to God the Father about Jesus. He says, there were gathered together against your holy servant, Jesus, notice, whom you anointed, and then he says, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, notice, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. So again, there's a lot going on here. He says again, for truly in the city there were gathered together against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed, he's talking to the Father, both Herod and Pontius Pilate, along with the Gentiles and the peoples of Israel, to do whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. So these wicked men were gathered together against Jesus. Here we see volition on display, where they were gathered together against Jesus. They weren't forced to do what they did. They were acting freely. Now they were acting according to their sinful natures and sinful values in Satan's world system, that's true. But nonetheless, these men acted of their own volition. So they were gathered together against Jesus to oppose and to crucify him. And yet Peter says that they did whatever your hand and your purpose predestined to occur. Now these wicked men, whose pride and power were threatened by Jesus, sought to destroy him by means of false witnesses and illegal trials, and to put him to death in the most horrible way possible, crucifixion. But God is sovereign, you see, and by means of his invisible hand And that's the best way that I know to describe it, because he's working behind the scenes. He's moving things. He's causing, he controls the weather. He controls circumstances. He controls prosperity. He controls famines in times of difficulty. He controls all these things. And so these are the things that help shape our lives, our characters. But these are the things that move us geographically. They move us spiritually. They move us around in life. And so God is orchestrating the events of life, and he's sovereignly controlling the events of human history. So God is sovereign, and by means of his invisible hand used the very actions of those who opposed him to accomplish the very thing that he desired, which was the death of Messiah for everyone. So here is a mystery that brings awe and bewilderment. As the wills of wicked men became the vehicle of divine destiny to produce exactly what God intended. Again, as I think about this, and I really work on some of these sentences, I try to craft the sentences and paragraphs, and sometimes I will work on a sentence or even a paragraph for sometimes an hour or two, just trying to get the language right, to pull in those biblical concepts, those truths of what's going on in the biblical text, and to try to frame that even from the larger biblical perspective. And it really becomes a challenge sometimes. So again, God is sovereign, and by means of his invisible hand used the very actions of those who opposed him to accomplish the very thing he desired, which was the death of Messiah for everyone. You see, it was God who ultimately placed Christ upon the cross. This was according to his predetermined plan. And so again, here is a mystery that brings awe and bewilderment, as the wills of wicked men became the vehicle of divine destiny to produce exactly what God intended. Now, to be clear, and I must be clear on this, that God was in no way the author of their sin. He didn't cause them to do what they did. He is in no way the author of their sin. Those who crucified Messiah acted freely. Yet their free actions were the modus operandi to accomplish his will. And so Messiah was crucified and bore the sins of even those who placed him on the cross.